Great. We're just going to welcome everybody to this session on macro level interventions A. I'm going to give a few announcements starting right on time. But in the meantime, just hang out. And there's a few, you can check out the poster sessions. We definitely want people to vote on those so that we can give our famous poster prizes. Great. Okay. Oops. Great, so while we wait for just a few minutes for everyone to join us and all the stragglers to come in with their tea, I would like to welcome everybody to this session on macro level interventions A. My name is Thalia Sparling and I'm the technical manager for this session. And the session will be chaired by Jan Lowe. Thank you for taking part in the ANH Academy Week, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything that you need to access the conference, all the materials and the program and the poster hall especially, it can be found on the ANH Academy website. And that's anh-academy.org/ANH2020. So before Jan Lowe takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. So I am recording this session and it will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you work with. You can access the chat box from these gray buttons down at the bottom of your screen under chat. We encourage you to turn on your video so that we can see your faces unless you have bandwidth issues. And if you do, either as a presenter or a participant, you might want to switch off your video to ensure a better connection. If you prefer not to share your video feed, you could also put a profile picture on if you're logged into your own Zoom account. So please do share your shining faces with us. Later in the session, we're going to open up the conversation with a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll do our best to raise them during the Q&A. If we have time, we may ask participants to raise their hands so we can call on you and unmute you, and you can speak your questions aloud. Lastly, if at any point you experience technical issues, do please check your internet and your audio settings. You can always reconnect to this session using the same Zoom link. If you have a technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box. And then I'd like to just take a quick poll. If you click on participants down at the bottom of your screen, I'd like to see how many people have watched at least one of the videos that we posted online, just to get a sense of how many people have participated. No judgment, just to give the speakers a sense. So I see there's 3 people who at least watched one, 5 now. If you didn't, you can click no, the red button. Great, so it looks like quite a few people in this session have at least watched one of our videos. That's great to know. All right, I think that's all from me, and I'll hand over to you, Jan, to take us forward.
Wonderful, thank you, Talia, and thanks for your great work this week and coordinating all these sessions. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm renaming this session, Macro Level Interventions A is a bit dull, but I'm calling this Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Fertilizer Subsidies and Are Not Afraid to Ask. So we're going to have a lot of time for discussions today, in part because unfortunately Martha Williams from the Sierra Leone Agricultural Research Institute is not able to join us. We have an exciting set of abstracts looking at fertilizer subsidies and different impacts of those subsidies. We're going to be starting out today hearing from Dr. Helen Walls from the London School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine, who is an assistant professor and the Global Health and Development Department of that institution. And she has a number of collaborators on the presentation that she is going to make. And she will have 6 minutes to present her information, and this will be followed by 5 minutes of questions. And then we will move on to Shweta Gupta, who I introduce later, and Dr. Solomon Amoabeng Nimako finally. So I think we are going to travel today from Malawi to India and then back to Ghana. And we'll be learning a lot about how fertilizer subsidies are being implemented, and also in some cases the dietary implications of those. So I think we're going to have an interesting session today, and I will start off handing it to Dr. Helen Walls, and please introduce your topic and move forward. Thank you.
Great, so thanks very much, Jan. And the screen is working, fantastic. Okay, great. So our study is titled Agricultural Input Subsidy Programs and Dietary Diversity, a qualitative assessment in Malawi with implications for policy implementation theory. And as Jan mentioned, there are a number of co-authors on this work, both from Malawi, the United Kingdom, as well as the Million Nanama, who's with UNICEF. So agricultural input subsidies are considered a way of improving agricultural productivity and food security in low and middle income countries. They're subsidies given to poor farmers to help them to afford the inputs needed to increase productivity. So for things such as fertilizer and hybrid seeds. But whilst these subsidies are considered beneficial for productivity and farmers' incomes, the evidence on this is mixed, and the sort of like the flow-on effects for nutrition are also unclear. And this is also because the staple crops that are often targeted by these subsidies are quite dense in calories, but low in essential nutrients. So the focus of this work is Malawi's Farm Input Subsidy Program, the FISP, which is a well-known example of an agricultural input subsidy program. So it was implemented in the 2005-06 agricultural season and provides subsidies on improved maize seed and fertilizer, and has later also included legume seeds. So this study builds on the existing work of the FISP to examine the implications of FISP policy design and implementation for dietary diversity. And it does so by drawing on theories of policy implementation. So there's often a gap observed between what was intended by a policy and then what actually occurred as a result of the policy. And to help explain this, there are two sort of key theories of policy implementation. One being the top-down approach and the other one being the bottom-up approach. So with the top-down approach, you've got people at the top, so to speak, who design the policy and then communicate it to others below who implement it. And this is a useful way to understand policy implementation, but it's also a bit unrealistic in practice. In sort of contrast, the bottom-up approach emphasises the complexity of the policy making process, and it emphasises that those who implement the policy often actually adapt it as they go about implementing it. And then sort of bringing these two theories together was Linda and Peters, and they've identified the factors that play a key role in shaping government policy implementation choices. And we draw on these three models in our study. So really, very briefly, of course, we've undertaken in-depth interviews and focus group discussions with key stakeholder groups. And in terms of our results, we found severe food and malnutrition issues in rural Malawi. And we found the respondents had different views on this lack of dietary diversity. So government, particularly district council policymakers, often saw it as a choice and that people were choosing to have fairly narrow diets. Whereas in the communities, people talked about diverse foods being unaffordable. Our respondents suggested that there was little impact of the FISP on dietary diversity, as agricultural output remained low and food in markets was considered unaffordable. And this was also, they talked about how this related to maize being a very low value crop. There were problems with FISP implementation, particularly in regard to several key issues, which I won't go into here. And the findings then provide new insight into agricultural input subsidy barriers to impact. So the findings, they really point to how the FISP is in many respects what could be considered to be a top-down policy, but at the same time you've got this sort of on-the-ground decision-making which is happening amongst the people targeted by the policy, which influences the impact of the policy, particularly in the way that coupons are often sold on to wealthier farmers, and there's sharing of coupons in the communities. And this is really, I think, a way to address social cohesion and support in the context of poverty. So in this way, our analysis really highlights a key component that could be added to the Linda and Peter's model of policy implementation, and this being the influence of the factors at the grassroots level shaped by the characteristics of the target population. So reforming the FISP could be beneficial, but policy might be more nutrition sensitive if it focused more directly on increasing smallholder farmer income and mitigating impacts of seasonality and extreme weather events. And a lot of our interviews were people discussed climate change. So we think that these findings have applicability to agricultural input subsidies in countries elsewhere. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging our funder, the drivers of food choice, our study participants and field workers, and our colleague Ephraim Chua. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Helen. You're within time. That's great. So I would like to open it up for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat quite yet, so everybody's still recovering from their tea break, but we expect to hear. Let me start out with a question. You mentioned in your abstract, actually, that you used the Walt and Gilson policy triangle framework for understanding the policy process to inform the design of interview guides. Could you explain, a lot of people don't look at this political economy issue, and I think you've done an interesting job of using the qualitative data to do so. Could you explain some key features of this framework and how you used it to design your instruments?
Yeah, sure. So there are a lot of, I guess, frameworks and theories from areas which in health are often called health policy analysis. Sometimes it's also called interpretive policy analysis from more of a political science point of view. And these frameworks and theories can be really useful for understanding policy processes. So in terms of, when it's within health policy analysis, one of the sort of key frameworks is this Vulcan-Gilson framework that you've picked up on. And it's a triangle. And it's a triangle because it describes 4 key components of policies, which are helpful for understanding the context in which a policy is, the process of the policy occurs. So 3 points at each of the corners of the triangle and 1 in the middle. It could have been a square. So the sort of, if I can remember them, the sort of key, they highlight the key components that are important to consider. And one of these is the actors, the stakeholders involved with the policy. Another is the context in which the policy is implemented. So this could be the social, political, and economic context, as well as particular sort of one-off features so something like COVID could be considered a acute feature of context which would need to be considered. So you've got actors and stakeholders, the context of the policy. I'm just trying to remember the other 2. The content of the policy, of course, and the features of that particular policy is important. And then I think the fourth is just talking about the process that the policy undergoes. So it's basically a simple framework to help understand sort of the broad context of in which the policy is designed, implemented, etc.
Okay, we have a question now, thank you, from Francis Knight. How did participants define or understand dietary diversity?
So when we spoke to people about dietary diversity and diets more generally, people gave a lot of examples of food insecurity. So that's a severe problem, particularly in the lean season in these areas. And with dietary diversity, people would often, I guess, give examples that showed quite good understanding of dietary diversity. So some of the respondents were aware in Malawi, there's a recommendation that people eat from at least 6 different food groups. And some people spoke about how they were aware of this because of a particular health worker that comes into the community and gives information about what they should be eating. But they said that it wasn't possible to eat that kind of diversity, and that was due to problems with affordability. So it was just considered unrealistic advice, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And another question from Grace Marquis. Did the policy really intend to affect dietary diversity? Was that part of its initial objective? If so, did the government have a mechanism of documenting change in diets?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the policy is the sort of primary sort of focus of the policy is to increase agricultural productivity and farmers' incomes. And then sort of secondary to that is to increase food security nationally. So the dietary or food focus of the policy is really about food security rather than dietary diversity. But we were interested to look at what effects it had on dietary diversity. So it's not the primary purpose of the policy, but of course it's interesting as people interested in nutrition to understand what implications it would have for dietary diversity.
So a question actually from Talia. Would trading and sale of the coupons have potential impact, for instance, through income generation that could improve dietary diversity? Or is it enough to reach a threshold change?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well. So people, when they spoke about recipients selling on the coupons, they often spoke about this as something that was unintended and negative and diluted the impact of the policy. But given that the policy is also intended to increase people's incomes and is in some way a social assistance program, you could see it, I think it's quite positive in that people could sell on the coupons to satisfy some like immediate financial needs, and someone else who can use the fertilizer purchases it. So I don't think it's altogether a negative thing. But there was like a lot of discussion from stakeholders about, in terms of the aims of the policy, about what the policy should be focused on. And lots of people within, say, sort of like district council would talk about how they think the policy would be more efficient if it targeted productive farmers. And there was, to address poverty, there was another program, a social assistance program. So there's lots of discussion about how the policy could be more efficient, which kind of relates to that as well.
And we'll have time to get back into that in the general discussion section. We need to move on now. Thank you very much, Helen, for that good presentation and excellent answers to the questions that were raised. The questions that haven't been asked yet, we'll be able to come back to them in our general discussion section. So now we're going to move on and hear from Shweta Gupta. Shweta is a research analyst at the International Food Policy Research Institute. We seem to be dominated by IFPRI for the rest of the session here between Dr. Nimako and Shweta. She is with the Environment, Production, and Technical Division of IFPRI, so I presume she's an agricultural economist. And Shweta, take it away.
Sure, I'll just share my screen.
You need to share your screen?
Yes, just a second. All right. Can you see my screen now? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Also, I think I'll have to, turn my video off because I'm hearing a lot of echoing in the voices. I think this is internet issue. So
yes, if everybody else could mute while Shweta is speaking, that would help with the background noise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Shweta, and the study is titled Designing Parental Support Programs, Lessons from Micronutrient Subsidies in Andhra Pradesh, India. And this is basically a retitling of what I originally submitted. The study basically focuses on how, the subsidy programs should be well informed and should take into account actual and effective costs before we start scaling them up or before you even start evaluating its impact. And this becomes especially important when the target group for which the subsidies are designed are heavily dependent upon them. And the best possible example is farmers. We also explore the possibilities of public-private partnership that can bring down the fiscal and administrative costs of running a subsidy program by optimally utilizing the resources and enhancing program outreach. So this study is basically motivated by two major factors. One is that a national level soil testing program called the Soil Health Card Scheme in 2015 in India revealed significant micronutrient deficiencies in AP. For instance, 40% of the soil samples that were tested were found zinc deficient and 33% was found boron deficient. So in response, the state government started providing these micronutrients at 50% subsidy rate initially, but more recently, they are being provided for free to the farmers from 2017-18 onwards. As I just mentioned, the study is based in AP, which is a southernmost state in India, and we cover 6 districts across the state, and we focus on paddy because it is one of the largest crops in the country and the state. And we conduct primary surveys of 3 major stakeholders, which we think play a major role in the scheme, that is farmers, extension workers, and fertilizer dealers. And we focus on zinc, because it forms nearly 70%, because it forms nearly 70% of the total subsidy outlay in the scheme and is also a critical input for paddy. I'll now quickly move over towards the finding from both the 3 groups that I just introduced you to. So zinc is not a popular input unlike other nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea. So the scheme actually helped in creating a market for that input since nearly 56% of the zinc users in our sample had purchased zinc from the market. However, if you go by the metric of land under zinc deficiency, then even right now 40% of the land still is zinc deficient in the state despite free provision as per the latest soil health card data since 2017-18. Also, you would generally think that more zinc is being supplied to regions which have higher zinc deficiency, but we don't see that happening currently. I suppressed the legends of the maps, but on the left you have soil zinc status district-wise, and darker regions represent areas which have higher zinc content or lower zinc deficiency. And on the right you have zinc supply district-wise again in kg per hectares. So, you can see that there are several areas which are dark on both the sides, meaning that they are places which have high zinc content despite that, they are being supplied more zinc, which should not happen in the scheme ideally. Primary surveys of our farmers reveal that nearly 45% of them have used zinc in the last 1 year. The major reasons that they cite for non-adoption for zinc include lack of interest or lack of knowledge about it or about its benefits. And our econometric analysis reveals that information or awareness about zinc can actually enhance its uptake significantly, which means that the state government should spend enough on enhancing these awareness programs. But the extension officers, who potentially are a major source of such information, they are unable to do so. The reason being that the scheme overburdens them with not just the extension work that they have to do, but also the scheme implementation and procurement of micronutrients, along with several logistical issues, as you can see in the graph, like biometric errors and authentication of beneficiaries, connectivity issues with the devices, which overcomplicate the entire process, making it difficult to carry out the scheme effectively. So this basically hinders the entire process of knowledge creation that we talked about initially, since several staff reports themselves to be overburdened and working overtime to fulfill the responsibilities. Along with that, free provision of zinc is unsustainable because it creates the possibility of product rationing, especially when zinc prices are rising worldwide. And as a result, the subsidy outlay that is set aside meets only 1/4 the total demand of zinc, which is there currently. And the private sector, it is right now kept out of the scheme, but is significant, cannot be neglected, given that 56% of zinc users actually use zinc, and also 37% of them even rely on them for information on agriculture. However, the free provision of zinc actually crowds out private investments to the extent that farmers use free zinc instead of purchasing them from the markets. So what should be done? There are two things that should be done. The state should focus on extension because it has a positive impact on zinc adoption, and it should enhance the role of private sector because it is an extensive network of private sector in AP, and it will bring down the cost of programs substantially. And this is my last slide. I'm sorry, I think I crossed the time limit, but I'll spend very less time on this, and it's my favorite slide. So how do you do it? The first step is that you replace the price subsidy by the direct cash transfer scheme. Farmers should buy zinc from the market at a positive price instead of they availing it for free from government sources. And whatever is the benefit that accrues to them should be transferred into their bank accounts directly. That's how you define a direct cash transfer scheme, right? And since we argue that free provision is not needed right now, something is wrong. Since I just argued that free provision is not needed right now because a demand base already exists for zinc, this will reduce, it will reduce the fiscal budget significantly, as you can see on the right. And on the left, what's important is that it will also free up the extension workers who can, together, when you pool these extension workers along with the money that the government has left, you can create a comprehensive awareness campaign to spread awareness for the farmers. And on the top right, you can see that there is another important.
Please wrap up, Shweta.
Yes, just last a few seconds. And on the top right, you can see that by involving private sector in the whole supply chain mechanism, because of the profit motives, advertising, and quality that they focus on, it will automatically feed into the comprehensive awareness campaign, ultimately benefiting farmers who can make an informed choice. So farmers would be actually at the heart of the entire, change, the new change program that we talk about. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shweta, for that introduction to this complex topic. We have a question that's come in from Ankita. Is the zinc supply chain, is this a government initiative? And actually, I would add on to this, how was the state government convinced to invest in a micronutrient subsidy?
Yeah, and nice question, actually. So as I mentioned in the first slide itself, from the soil health card data, so there's a national level scheme called soil health card scheme in which soil samples are collected from farmers' fields, and they are being tested for several deficiencies of several micro and macronutrients, and it was launched in 2015. So the tests from those the tests of those soils revealed that the state was actually suffering from significant micronutrient deficiencies. So as I mentioned, several inputs like zinc, boron, and gypsum were found to be in the deficient state. And that's how the government decided to actually invest in it, initially by giving it at 50% subsidy rate, but then providing it for free to provide additional support. So yeah, it was a government initiative, and it was motivated by the soil health card scheme. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, could you give us some indication of what the yield benefit is to the paddy production by using zinc? and were demonstrations you done to encourage the farmers to see the benefits of zinc?
Yeah, so we have focused on paddy, which is rice for. Around 8 to 10%, zinc has a benefit of increasing yields of paddy by around 8 to 10% from the zinc trials that were conducted by Center for Maize Improvements, that is CIMIT, if you know already about it. So they have conducted zinc trials, and they have revealed that around 8 to 10% of paddy crop can be increased by applying zinc in the correct dosages as is suggested by the soil scientists. So this study definitely will have an impact towards yield, in enhancing the yield of the crop, which is, and you can say that it's just paddy, what about the other crops, but it has significant benefits on other crops as well. But we focused on paddy since it is one of the largest crops in the state and is consumed significantly nationally.
Great. I'd like to call on Francis Zotor. Hi, Francis. Good to see you in this session. To ask your question, Talia, if you could unmute him, please.
Thank you, John. A very interesting presentation, and I was glued to it. I was more concerned about the level of focus on the vulnerable, particularly the children. And so if attention could be focused on the vulnerable, I think that would be a great thing. And I was really looking forward to hearing that aspect. Thank you.
Okay. I think Francis was asking about how addressing this issue can have a nutritional impact, if I'm correct.
That's correct. I think it's relating to the fact that zinc is also very important for human health, especially young child growth. And are you capturing those follow-on effects? The plant is better off, but also are people eating the rice plants better off?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Jan. I'm glad that Francis pointed that out. So, I have results from two major reports that are on the top of my head. One is from CNNS data, or Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey, in which they collect blood samples, urine samples, and stool samples from the population in the age group of 1 to 19 for India across several states. And what they find is that, children, if you talk about AP specifically, the targeted area that we chose, children in the age group of 1 to 10, whatever samples were collected, around 10% of them were found to be zinc deficient. And if you go in the higher age group, which is 10 to 19 years of age, there 20% of blood samples were found to be zinc deficient. And in India overall, 30% of samples were found to be zinc deficient in the age group of 1 to 19 years. So, and another one is Harvard report. I exactly don't remember the year, I guess it was 2019, in which they revealed it. So that also points out that zinc deficiency among humans in India is increasing rapidly, and it is mostly constrained in the southern regions, southern states of India, like Andhra Pradesh and several other states which consume rice and produce rice a lot. Rice is actually a paddy, or rice is actually a crop which is highly zinc deficient. So making sure that your crops have enough zinc content will definitely, I'm not a nutritionist for that matter, so I don't know exactly, how much would be a one-on-one transformation on if you make sure that your crops have enough zinc, how much of that, gets translated into lower zinc deficiency among humans. And to clarify, I'm also not an agriculture economist, but I'm into agriculture, of course. So, but I do know that since paddy is one of the major crops and is consumed, nearly 70% of food production in the state that we focused on comes from paddy, and nearly 40% of food grains produced in India, 40% of that is again paddy. So if you are taking care of nutritional aspects of such a significant crop, you're automatically making sure that people who face nutritional deficiencies of zinc particularly are also, able to surpass that problem. So yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the answers to those questions. There are a couple more questions in the chat box that we'll come to during the general discussion. But right now, I'd like to move on. And we'd like to hear from Solomon Amoa-Bengnimako, who is a visiting fellow also at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. and he is in the Development Strategy and Governance Division. So welcome, Solomon, and we look forward to hearing about maize subsidies, fertilizer subsidies in Ghana.
Okay. Thank you. Let me try and get my screen on. Okay. So good day to everyone. I'm Solomon Amwabing, and I prepared this work with my colleagues, Mikal and Chris Akelogutu, both from the University of Nairobi. So I will try looking at the agricultural commercialization effect of Ghana's fertilizer subsidy program on diet quality in northern Ghana. So as it were, food insecurity and malnutrition are still big global issues, and mostly agricultural strategies have been advocated for, and they usually come in the form of pro-staple approaches and targeted at smallholders, and such is the shape of Ghana's fertilizer subsidy program, which is going to be our focus for today. So the program has been in existence since 2008, and it has indeed contributed to improving food insecurity situations and hunger situations. A stated objective of the study, of course, was to improve input use, yields, and by extension, marketable surpluses and commercialization. However, in spite of achieving reducing hunger situation a little bit for nutritional diversity, consumption by way of nutritional diversity has not been realized as much, and this is what has led us to look for answers to some of such questions. So from this motivation, we try to characterize households of the participation in the subsidy program, and then we assess the effects of the program first on maize commercialization, and then now we go ahead to look at the implications of maize commercialization as occurring from the program for diet quality. The study was conducted in the Upper West region of northern Ghana, which is quite malnourished, in fact, the most malnourished in the country, poverty in economic activity. So it brings that linkages between agriculture and nutrition quite a lot. So in doing this, 3 districts in the region were selected, and a total of 247 households, farming households, interviewed in the region. The survey was done in 2018, sorry. So we conceptualized that a government subsidy program or a government support program, in this case, the main one of interest being the fertilizer subsidy program, will increase commercialization through marketable surpluses. And then through that, increased incomes will lead to improved food security, and the influence of socioeconomic and community characteristics in the food environment were also accounted for. So we abstracted the conceptual framework directly into this equation here, where we hypothesized food consumption to be a function of, among other things, the commercialization, which we indicated with CCI, commercialization index for maize. And of course, commercialization index or commercialization itself is a function of some other things, of which the GFSP is a factor. So here, one key contribution of this study is that we break a chain of studies where food consumption is conceptualized to be a direct function of inputs. So here we try to first look at, but we know that inputs operate through their production outcomes to influence consumption in a normal agricultural household model. So that's what we try to replicate here, where the effect of the subsidy program works through commercialization to influence consumption. So to our results, firstly, we characterize households by some basic production outcomes, and we find that maize outputs or maize yields were greater for participants of the fertilizer subsidy program.
Solomon, we do
close to a double or more than a double. Yep.
Solomon, we just lost you a little bit. Maybe try turning off your video and just repeat what you said a minute ago because we couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Then let me go back a bit. Okay. So
Please turn off your personal video so you can get more bandwidth.
Come again?
Yeah, please turn off your personal video right now while you're presenting your slides because you're going in and out. Yes, you'll get more bandwidth. Thank you.
All right. Let me do that. I think I'm off now. Can we go on? Hello?
Please do. Please go on.
All right. So to our results, we find that maize yields per kilograms per acre was highest for the participants' households in the fertilizer subsidy program by almost double relative to the non-participants. And maize market participation by way of households which actually sold some maize was also highest for participants by over 50% households. In the same line for households which sold maize, we found that almost 40% of maize output was sold by participant households compared to just 5 to 6% by non-participants. Quite interestingly, from here we are seeing that the commercialization is quite supported by the program, or the program is contributing to commercialization. We also find that more households, participants' households in the program allocated more land, crop land to maize than non-participants, almost 14% more land than non-participants. So from the foregoing, we are seeing a picture where the fertilizer subsidy program seems to be promoting specialization in maize and a reliance on maize, but there are commercialization gains. So looking at food consumption as measured by the food consumption score, we find a very slight better diets among non-participants compared to the participants. This is quite interesting, looking at the commercialization effect. So this chart also shows that truly more households in the non-participant of the program were in the acceptable consumption region of the food consumption score. So to our main results, this is our first stage of our model showing the factors that influence participation in the fertilizer subsidy program, but we are not very much interested in this. So here we look at the effect of the program, having treated it in the first stage on maize commercialization, and we find that truly the program increases the percentage of maize output sold by close to 34% for
Please wrap
households.
up, Solomon.
Great. However, by way of consumption, we find that commercialization did not contribute much to, in fact, it even has a negative influence on consumption. So the commercialization gains do not appear to lead to consumption. And this is explained by some factors in the food environment as mentioned, including distance to market and female participation in decisions. So we find that generally the program has an effect on commercialization and yields, but it does not translate to consumption. And so we recommend a need for an expansion of the program to support a wider range of crops, especially at the production level, and then upgrade of physical and market infrastructure to support consumption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Solomon, for that presentation. I don't see any questions for you directly in the chat yet, but I'm sure they are coming. Okay. But I would like to ask a question. Can you provide some insights as to the gender dynamics in Northern Ghana? For example, who within the household controls the income from maize sales and makes the majority, and who in the household makes the majority of food purchases?
Great. So food purchases are basically the responsibility of women, but income and major agricultural decisions are made by male. In fact, from our focus group discussion before the survey, we we found that a common practice in the region is that after the production season, the male household head gives some number of bags of maize to the wife. Let's say maybe 4 bags of maize is given to the wife to be used by the household for the entire season, for the entire non-production season. So that has been the dynamic. So production and income decisions are mainly made by men, but decisions pertaining to consumption are made by women. And that's probably why we are finding here that when women are a bit involved, consumption is slightly higher.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that actually was preloaded from the video viewer. Of households, I imagine they're looking by income
Sorry, Jan,
categories.
I lost you. Sorry, I lost you. Can you please?
Okay. Yes. What were the different levels of commercialization, I presume, by income level of the different households?
Oh, so sorry, I'm still not getting that.
Huh. Okay. What were the different levels of commercialization by income level of different households?
Okay, that's great. So by way of income levels, households with better commercialization or higher commercialization were quite had higher incomes. But an interesting thing here is that the overall commercialization of households was quite balanced. The overall commercial, taking all crops as one, was quite balanced. But you find that the commercialization for participants' households was more skewed towards maize.
Okay. You have a question, or your fellow panelists, for Solomon?
Sorry, do you want
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Solomon, interesting presentation, thanks. I was wondering if you could comment on increasing the maize yield as a commercial strategy, because in Malawi, maize is relatively low value compared to other crops. So increasing maize yield was perhaps not a great strategy for families in terms of being able to then engage with markets to purchase other crops.
Thank you. Yes, that is one finding or one observation. And in this table, that's why I was presenting this on the nature of groundnut commercialization, because in the region, groundnuts or peanuts are seen as a crop of higher value. So you find that the maize subsidy seems to be skewing commercialization away from the traditional high value crop in the region towards a less high value crop, yeah, which could be one of the contributions why commercialization towards a lower value crop is not translating into food consumption. Because like I'm saying, we find that households which are not participating in the subsidy program are having quite a balanced commercialization. They are more commercialized towards the higher or traditional market crop.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think now we're going to enter into a more generalized discussion. Thank you, Solomon, for those answers. Now we're open to discussing fertilizers subsidies in general and getting back to your specific questions for each of the participants. But we do have one question to get the action started that goes to all of the panelists from Jody Harris. And Jody, would you please like to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So I'm wondering whether any of the panelists in any of your work looked at issues of equity in your analysis. So whether subsidies were differentially beneficial or not for different groups of people, whether it was women and men, whether it was rich or poor, whether it was any other sort of subgroups in your analysis? I'd be interested in any reflections.
Helen, would you like to start with an answer, and then we'll move to Shweta and then Solomon?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jody. So that was one of the specific questions that we gave to people in the interviews and the focus groups. So we asked them if they thought the subsidy had affected different groups of people differently, and we gave them some examples of different demographic groups. And generally people said no, and they thought, for example, that it didn't have any different effects for men and for women. But we did have a few people who spoke about some differences. So I'm just trying to remember, there were a couple of comments regarding legumes, for example. So legumes are also targeted by the Farm Input Subsidy program, but they're regarded as a crop for women. And there were comments about how if the farmer was a woman, she may choose to, she may want to diversify what she was growing, but ultimately whether she was able to or not would be like the decision of her husband. So there were sort of comments about, I guess, the women's decision making in the context of not being able to make some decisions unless she was the head of the household. We also asked about whether rich and poor households were affected differently, and there weren't too many sort of comments about that. So it was, yeah, just a few, I guess, a few comments about gender dynamics, but relatively few, and most people suggested that men and women were not affected differently.
Okay, we'll move on to Shweta.
So I think one major equity aspect that our study, the way we involved it in our study, was by controlling for different types of caste groups, in the sense that general category and several other categories of respondents. And what we found was that respondents who live far off from the nearest markets, they were found to be negatively affected by the scheme. In the sense, they were left out of the scheme in general, for obvious reasons that they don't have access to markets, and they are usually poorer in terms of several other amenities, infrastructure in the areas. So being in the remote area negatively impacts you as compared to if you're living around markets. Because it turns out that there are not many block level offices or cooperative stores in the villages in which the zinc under micronutrient subsidy scheme was being supplied. So people who lived around those were benefited more as compared to people who couldn't live around those. And we couldn't focus on women because almost entire sample was of male respondents. So yeah, we couldn't look at the gender aspects, but yeah, in terms of accessibility towards this. And also an interesting finding was that tenants who are usually left out of the scheme because they don't have better let's say necessary paperwork to show and give a proof of their cultivation practices or their land records. They usually don't have such documents which are necessary to be a part of the scheme. They were actually not being left out because lately the scheme has made had been making amendments and changes to even involving the tenants in the scheme. Whereas originally on paper it says that you have to have a land record, you have to be a landowner, because the soil health card based on which you would be given zinc, that is given only to people who own land. But the scheme has now become more comprehensive, even involving tenant farmers. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Solomon, can you comment on the equity issue now, please?
Okay, directly by design, there was no equity considerations, although smaller landholders were prioritized as per the program design. However, on the field, we realized that, interestingly, those with bigger land holdings were getting more access to the subsidy. And again, there were not really any observed gender differences by way of access. And infrastructure also played a role. Those who were further away from urban centers had a lower access. And quite interestingly, connection with extension officers, those who had better connection with extension visits and frequency of extension visits with the community, such communities were able to access it the more. But as per the program design, there was no direct equity dimensions.
Really interesting. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. So let's move on. If Grace Marquis has a question for all the panelists. Grace wants you to reflect probably beyond your own experiences. Grace?
Sorry, Jan, we couldn't hear that. You broke up a little bit.
Okay, Grace Marquis has a question to ask that will call on our panelists to look beyond their own experiences into the literature and other fertilizer subsidy programs. Do you have Grace Marquis? Could you unmute, please?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I wondered whether or not you have any knowledge of programs that cross sectors beyond ministries of agriculture, include ministries of health or gender, women, whatever, to try to bring together this, where you would like to see, which is not only an increase in agricultural production and income, but also health, equity, education. Do you know of any programs across the world that actually do that?
Among our panelists, anybody would like to respond to that?
Unfortunately, we haven't explored such kind of linkages. You know, when we were exploring the micronutrient subsidy scheme in AP, I mean, I'm not sure exactly about the world, but in AP especially, we didn't explore these kind of linkages. So yeah, I think I have limited knowledge on the concept.
Ellen, anything to add?
I think in Malawi, this program is considered a multi-sectoral program with a lot of different stakeholders involved in the fora related to it. But from our interviews, we found in practice it was the people from agriculture who knew the most about it, and people from health were not particularly familiar with it and just spoke quite generally in terms of how it may be affecting nutrition.
Well, if I can take people back a little bit to your political economy look and just ask the panelists in their opinion, are maize subsidies there really to help the farmers, or do governments engage in subsidies of staple foods to ensure that the urban population has enough staple to eat? What do you think is the driver behind the adoption of fertilizer subsidies by African governments or by Indian governments? What's the real driver? I mean, you've been looking at political economy in some of your situations.
Yeah, should I start?
That's why I was interested. Ellen?
Yeah, sure. So, so there are. I guess we've looked at some of what other people have written about this in Malawi. So there's a sort of idea, I guess, often described that in Malawi the program is really beneficial for government in terms of helping to bolster its popularity and legitimacy. And it's also a program that I guess elites can support, because elites tend to support programs. It's not just Malawi. I think it's everywhere, that tend to support programs where the poor are seen to be working for their gains. So it's in that way, it's a program that can be supported in Malawi both by the elites as well as by the population who feel like they're getting this helpful, supportive program and directly benefiting from that.
Solomon, any thoughts on this?
I think the urban population is the target by way of the benefits, because usually when it comes to food security and food prices in a political context, the urban population seems to carry the face the more. When the urban population feels the effect of food crisis, it manifests a lot more on the political economy. So I think the main driver is because you usually speak about the national impact or the national outcome of food security, but you find that when you go deep down, the same households which are producing are the most affected by hunger.
Shweta, do you have anything to add from your perspective in the Indian case? Because you're the one with the micronutrients being subsidized, which is unusual.
Yeah. So, I would speak in general context in the fertilizer subsidy context. I think in India, the Indian government spends a lot on a huge fraction of their budget on fertilizer subsidies, for several reasons that, they have the land soils have been characterized by lack of several nutrients, and this has even been confirmed by the soil health card data. So I think, and this problem is because of this thing, they have popularized fertilizers so much in India that ultimately the farmers have started overusing them, and because of that, the soil is getting degraded, and which is one of the reasons why there are micronutrient deficiencies in the country in the first place. So I think the government needs to shift its perspective in overemphasizing on these inputs, and I think this is what the government has been doing now, because the general fertilizer subsidy program in India is being now, the changes are being made, and they are also shifting from direct price subsidy, from price subsidies, that was originally the case in fertilizer subsidy program in India, towards a direct cash transfer scheme, to basically make sure that, the problems that arise in price subsidies, the whole market distortions that arise, they are taken care of. There are gains from private sectors if they are involved. They have multiple profit benefits. Their profit drive can actually enhance the general awareness that the farmers need to have. They need to explore this linkage between, somebody was mentioning in the chat box that, the study, you should not only just enhance extension on, the use of zinc in crops, but also how it impacts health. So that is an interesting thing that should be told to the farmers as well. So yeah, I think this is what I think about the entire scheme.
Okay. While we have you online, Shweta, we have a question from Nikhil.
Sorry, we need to actually wrap up pretty soon. It's the end of the session.
Oh, okay.
So,
great. Okay. So I would,
one final thought.
Yeah, one final thought from each of you, and I would like that thought to be around, people love subsidies. Governments, they're very popular politically, they're hard to take away. But I would like to wrap up with each of you saying, how should your specific countries pay for these subsidies? Because as you know, the United States and the European Union have been subsidizing agriculture for a long time. So the question is, how do we pay for those subsidies? So in your wrap-up remarks, please touch on that and any take-home messages you would like this group to have.
But please, we are actually on quite a schedule, so if you could just keep your remarks very short, I'd appreciate it.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Helen, do you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, it's with this programming, it's funded by the government currently, supported by donors, but I would just say that I think government should be considering the opportunity costs of the subsidy, and looking at how it could be improved, but also looking at more widely at how nutrition could be most effectively improved in the country.
Thank you. Shweta?
I think the government just needs to focus on one thing, whether there is any possibility of any resource allocation while they're designing these subsidy programs, because this is what we observed in our study. You have a possibility of doing that, and that will significantly reduce your subsidy outlay. So explore possibilities of resource allocation and you should be good.
Very good, thank you. And Solomon, you have the last word.
Okay, I think we should promote agribusiness strategies on the fringes of agriculture in these rural areas to get farmers being more sustainable in the long run.
Okay, thank you very much to all members of the panel. Talia, I'm sure you have some wrap-up reminders of next sessions, and I apologize for letting the group go over. That was my error.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Jan, for moderating this very interactive session. I hope it was informative for everyone. If there are remaining questions, we can also we do keep a log of those, and maybe the individual presenters can respond in time. So very quickly, thank you very much for attending. We have just a few more events in our ANH 2020 virtual Academy to go, and we would like you to go now if you'd like and view our poster hall. The link is in the chat box, and there'll be about, we're actually going to start the closing ceremony very soon, actually now, I think. We've used up our time, but if you'd like to go quickly vote, you can do that and then join us, please, for the closing ceremony. And following that at 4 p.m., there's going to be a social hangout. You'll have to bring your own tea or water or wine, but we will have music. People are going to share their different instruments and a time to relax and hang out together in a more informal setting. So please do join us. Let us see your faces, and thank you very much. So over to our closing ceremony. I'll end the session now. Thank you, everyone.
See you at the closing, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.